Now, turning to the speaker, today we have Siomak Zabihi-Moghaddam. He has his PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Haifa in Israel and has been a visiting faculty at Western Washington University and Bennington College in Vermont. He's written numerous articles on a range of topics relating to the Middle East and the Baha'i faith, published in the Journal of Women's History, Journal of Religious History, Contemporary Review of Middle East and Iranian Studies. He's also edited a volume of Persian primary sources on the massacre of the Baha'is in Yazd in 1903. It was a major pogrom against the Baha'is. This was published in 2016 by Baha'i Verlag in Germany. And he and his family, excuse me, currently are living in Bellingham, Washington. He's been there now since 2012. So we'll now turn this over to Siomak. Siomak, welcome and thank you for joining us. And we are all very much looking forward to your presentation today.
Thank you very much, Rob. I'm very happy for the opportunity to talk about the Shaykh Ṭabarsí episode. I think it's very fitting that we should be reflecting about this episode in the month of May this year, which is exactly 170 years ago that this episode ended. So in this regard, it's a very good occasion to think about it. In the title of my presentation, I say that the Shaykh Ṭabarsí episode was a turning point in the Bábí history, in the Bábí faith, and there are a number of reasons for that. This was the first time that the Qajar state began to actively suppress the Bábís. Until this time, the Báb had been confined in Maku and then later Chehrir, and his contact with his followers had been restricted, but otherwise the state had not actively suppressed the Bábís, persecuted the Bábís. But beginning with the Shaykh Ṭabarsí episode, we have a series of clashes between the Bábís and the state that led over the course of, starting from 1848 to 1853, led to the deaths of approximately 2,700 Bábís. And the Shaykh Ṭabarsí episode also being the first of these four major clashes between the Bábís and the Qajar state, it influenced the developments that led to the later battles between the Bábís and government troops. And we know that after the Shaykh Ṭabarsí episode, the state acted much more quickly and also forcefully against the Bábís when hostilities broke out in Neyriz and Zanjan in 1850. And it was also at the Shaykh Ṭabarsí that half of the letters of the living lost their lives, including Quddus and Mulla Husayn, the last letter of the living and also the first one to believe in the Báb. The episode itself lasted about 8 months, and by January 1849, there were about 500 Bábís gathered at Shaykh Ṭabarsí. And by March of 1849, the number of the troops and irregulars who were fighting against the Bábís had reached somewhere between 10 and 12,000. And they had artillery with themselves as well. And it is estimated that about 1,500 people lost their lives during the Shaykh Ṭabarsí episode, including some 450 Bábís. I would like to just very briefly say about the Shaykh Ṭabarsí episode that among the four Bábí state clashes that happened between 1848 and 1853, we know most about the Shaykh Ṭabarsí episode because it is the one episode that is best documented. We have different eyewitness accounts, 3 important eyewitness accounts about this episode, and other sources. Maybe I have this information in my slides. Those of you who are interested can look at the slides, and it is perhaps sufficient that I say that, you know, for an episode that happened in the middle of the 19th century in Iran, this is quite significant that we have so many primary sources and important sources about this episode. So we know quite a lot about this episode. Then it is also important to say a few things about the wider context, about the situation surrounding the Bábí community at this time, in order to understand better what happened, why this Shaykh Ṭabarsí episode, why it occurred, and the state chose to act against the Bábís and send troops against them and suppress them. At this time, the Bab was incarcerated at Shahriq, which is in northwestern Iran. And I have a map, we will look at it in a minute. And while he was at Shahriq, he was summoned to Tabriz, brought to Tabriz for interrogation. And this happened in late April, around the trial of the Bab in Tabriz took place around the 23rd of April, 1848. That is, 3 months before the Shaykh Tabarsi episode began. And as you also recall from the Dawnbreakers, from Nabil's narrative, it was in Tabriz at this trial that the Bab openly proclaimed to be the promised Qa'im, the figure that all Shi'i Muslims or all Muslims, the Qa'im is the same figure as the Mahdi that the Sunni Muslims are also waiting for. So this, he claimed to be the promised Qa'im, and this was a major challenge to the ulama, to the clerical establishment. Because the ulama, they claim that they hold religious authority, exercise their religious authority on behalf of the Qa'im. And if they acknowledge the Bab to be the Qa'im, then they have to submit to his authority. They would have, their function would have ceased to exist, according to one historian who has written about this. So because of this open challenge, the Bab was bastinadoed. And it seems to me that after this incident and after the claim of the Bab to be the Qa'im was publicly known, then persecution of the Bábís intensified. And so this explains a lot why, when we get to September 1848, then the Bábís that gather at Shaykh Ṭabarsí, why they are attacked, and this was the background to it. I have some images that I would like to show you. This is an image of the castle of Shahriq, where the Bab was confined in the last 2 years of his life. Here is another image. This is much more recent from today's Iran. And this is the mosque in Tabriz where the Bab was tried. His interrogation took place in this mosque. And this drawing is from 1840, so 4 years before the Bab was tried there. And this one, this is an image from today's Iran. It shows the same mosque in Tabriz. So I mentioned that this, the trial of the Bab, the interrogation of the Bab in Tabriz led to increased hostility towards the Bábís and greater incidents of persecution of the Bábís, more incidents of persecution. And we have a contemporary source. It's a letter that we have from Dr. Austin Wright, who was an American missionary who was stationed in the town of Urumiyeh, which is not far from Shahriq, where the Bab was held in confinement. And he has written this about what was happening at the time. He says that the matter became so serious that the government issued an order that the Bab should be taken to Tabriz and bastinadoed, and that his disciples, wherever found, should be fined and punished. And this also explains why, after the conference of Badasht, which was also held in the summer of 1848, a few months after the interrogation of the Bab, then when the Bábís left Badasht, they were attacked in the village of Niala in Mazandaran, and some of them were killed, and they were also, some were injured, and they were, all their belongings were plundered. And we have also in the summer of 1848, shortly before Mulla Husayn and the party of the Bábís who left Mashhad, before they left Mashhad, there was a clash between the Bábís and the townspeople in Mashhad. So all these incidents happened because of the, in a sense, we could say it was the trial of the Bab and the open claim, the public claim of the Bab that triggered these, increased, we could say, persecution of the Bábís. So now, talking a little bit about after finishing talking about the background of this of the Shaykh Tabarsi episode, I would like to move on to describe what happened. And the Tabarsi struggle, the prelude to the event was the march of a group of Bábís who were led by Mulla Husayn from Khorasan to Mazandaran. And I mentioned briefly before that they left Mashhad. So they left Mashhad in July 1848, and by September they had reached Mazandaran. And they were initially about 200 Bábís who were in Mulla Husayn's party. And when they arrived in Mazandaran, there was an encounter between the party of Prince Khanlar Mirza, who was the new governor of Mazandaran, and the Bábís, some of the Bábís in Mulla Husayn's party. And this happened, this is in the second half of August 1848. And when Khanlar Mirza discovered that this group that were traveling through Mazandaran were Bábís, he turned to them and told them that you are all Bábís and mufsid fil ars. And this is a technical term. It comes from the Quran, but it is significant because in Islamic law, if you are a mufsid fil ars, then it is lawful to kill you. So he said that the Bábís were all mufsid fil ars, corrupt on the earth, and killing you is obligatory. And he also said that Muhammad Shah has ordered that wherever you are found, you should be killed. And this also shows again the kind of, the tensions that surrounded the Bábís in the months following the interrogation of the Báb in Tabriz. And here is a map of Iran. This is Mashhad, where Mulla Husayn and his party left there and embarked toward Mazandaran. They went to Mazandaran, and from Mashhad to Mazandaran, here is Shaykh Ṭabarsí and Barfurush, the major town in Mazandaran. From Mashhad to Shaykh Ṭabarsí is about 770 kilometers. And then Shahriq that we talked about is here western Iran, and there are some other cities that you can see in the map, and we can look at it later if necessary. So then there is the question, why were the Bábís heading for Mazandaran? And it's a question that Nabil does not address, at least in the version of the Nabil's narrative that we have, the Dawnbreakers, he does not speak about this, the reason that the Bábís, Mulla Husayn and his group of Bábís left Mashhad and went to Mazandaran. But we have other sources that explain that, provide some information that indicate that the Bábís, they intended to go to Shahriq and once there to demand that the Báb be released. And I think this was after the Báb was bastinaded in Tabriz that the Bábís decided that this humiliation should end and they should not allow the Báb to remain in prison. So this was the reason that the Bábís decided to go and rescue the Báb. But what they were planning to do after that, we have very scant information about that, and maybe if there should be time, we can talk about it later. But for now, it's just that we know that the Bábís, when Mulla Husayn left Mashhad, the plan was that they would go through Mazandaran to Shahriq and then try to find ways to release the Báb from his confinement. Then when they had arrived in Mazandaran, something happened that changed the whole situation in the country. Muhammad Shah, who had been ill for some years, he died on the 4th of September, and this is a few days before the Bábís arrived in the town of Barfurush, which was the most significant commercial center of Mazandaran and also the largest town in Mazandaran. And when the Bábís arrived there, then they were attacked by a mob of 3,000 to 4,000 townspeople and villagers, and they did not want to allow the Bábís to enter the town. And Mulla Husayn instructed the Bábís to leave the town, but then in the meantime, the mob shot some of the Bábís dead, and so Mulla Husayn returned their attack, and the other Bábís who had arrived, they had taken lodging in the caravanserai of the town, so they decided to stay. And it is important to understand why the Bábís decided to stay in Barfurush and just did not continue with their journey. The reason is that after the death of Muhammad Shah, the whole country was plunged into chaos. And we have a letter that is written by an Iranian who was sent by the British Chargé d'Affaires in Tehran to Mazandaran to examine the situation and report back to the British mission in Tehran. And he writes this, and the date of the letter is the 12th of September. which means it was written the day after the Bábís arrived in Barfurush. So the situation that he describes is exactly the situation that the Bábís were facing. He writes that Sari, and this is the capital of Mazandaran, the provincial capital. Sari is the only town not in a disturbed state in all Mazandaran, and the roads are infested by robbers in every direction. So the Bábís, if they wanted to continue their journey, they would risk being attacked by people who would probably take them to be robbers, and also because of the the roads were not safe, they could also be attacked by robbers themselves. And so in this way, they did not have much of a choice to continue their journey. They had to stay for a while in a major town that had they could find sufficient provisions for their party, and until the situation is stabilized in the country, and then after that they would be able to move on. So this was the reason that once they received the news of the death of Muhammad Shah in Mazandaran, the closest town, major town to them was Barfurush, so they decided to go there. And also the Bábís were not used to the climate of Mazandaran, and also coming from Khorasan, from Mashhad, they had been completely exhausted and they needed a place to rest. So this is why they came to Barfurush. And I should say also about Barfurush that this is, some of you remember, Barfurush was the hometown of Quddus, but also it was there that Sayyid al-Ulama, a major opponent of the Bábís, who was extremely hostile to Quddus and the Bábís in general, he resided in Barfurush. So it wasn't, the Bábís could have expected that when they went to Barfurush that there could be trouble. But as I explained, they really did not have any other choice, because they could not stay in any small village because they wouldn't be able to find provisions. And also earlier they had been forced to leave another village because people had complained that, when the Bábís were there and they were paying very well for the provisions that they purchased, the prices had gone up, and so it had created some tensions. So the Bábís, I mentioned that there were some clashes between the Bábís. They were attacked a few times in Barfurush, but these attacks stopped when Abbas Qoli Khan Larijani, who was a prominent Mazandarani chief, he arrived and he negotiated with the Bábís, and the Bábís agreed with him that they would leave the area. And it seems that the Bábís, they wanted to leave Mazandaran. And so they left Barfurush on the 20th of September, but when they left the town, they were followed by a mob that wanted to take revenge, because as I said, then some had been killed on both sides, some Bábís and also some of the townspeople had been killed in the clashes that had happened. And so the mob wanted to take revenge, so they followed the Bábís when they left Barfurush. And a while after they had left the town, then Khosrow Qadi Kalai, who was a brigand, he joined the Bábís with his armed men, and he said that, told the Bábís that you need protection. There are so many people who are following you and want to kill you. And he also knew the area. He was obviously from Mazandaran, and the Bábís needed someone to show them the way out of Mazandaran. So they reluctantly agreed that Khosrow Qadi Kalai should escort them. But then Khosrow, his true intention was to loot the Bábís, and so he led them around the countryside. And so they started, both Khosrow's men and also the people who had followed the Bábís and some of the villagers started to secretly killing them off. And when Mulla Husayn discovered this, he instructed that they need to get rid of Khosrow, and so they killed Khosrow and also drove off his men. And by this time it had become midnight, so they needed a place to stay for the night. So they took shelter in the shrine of Shaykh Ṭabarsí, which was nearby. And this is the shrine of Shaykh Tabarsi is about only 24 kilometers from Barfurush. But because Khosrow, he knew, how he wanted to lead the Bábís around the countryside to have opportunity to kill them off, and so that it would become dark and it would be easier for him to, kill the Bábís. So that's why he had just led them around in the area, not very far from Barfurush. And Shaykh Tabarsi, maybe I can also mention that this is a prominent Shi'i scholar who lived in the 12th century. So this was his tomb in Mazandaran. He's buried there. And they arrived there on the 21st of September. Shaykh Tabarsi at the time, the shrine, it consisted of a building that housed the tomb of this sheikh, and also a grassy enclosure that was surrounded by a wall that was 2 meters high. And E.G. Brown, he visited Shaykh Tabarsi exactly 40 years later in 1888, and he writes that it was a place of little natural strength. And so it is obvious that the Bábís did not go there for strategic reasons. They just needed a shelter for the night because there were people who were attacking them. They had many enemies in the area, so they just wanted a place to stay for the night. But then when they arrived there, they knew that they would be attacked, so they started to build some rudimentary defenses around the shrine. I have some images that I would like to show you. This is a map of the area of Shaykh Tabarsi, and I would like you to focus on the body of water that is in the middle of this map. And Shaykh Tabarsi is very close to this body of water. And here is another map that shows the area. You can see how, this, of course, this is a map from today's Iran. And at the time, the forest was much thicker, and there were fewer houses and the localities. So the number of inhabitants in Mazandaran at the time was far fewer people in this area, and also much more marshland in the area. So it was really, the surroundings were inhospitable. It was not easy for the Bábís to get away from the area once they were there, but there were people who wanted to attack them and kill them. So it was very easy for people to hide in the forest and shoot at the Bábís, or in other ways kill them. And here is again a map of the larger area. This is the town to the left, the town of Babol, and Shaykh Tabarsi again is in the middle of this map, and Sari, that I mentioned, the capital of Mazandaran, is here. And this is another town closer to Shaykh Tabarsi. And here is, we have the sketch of Shaykh Tabarsi that Brown prepared after he visited Shaykh Tabarsi in 1888. So we have the shrine itself, and we have the tomb of the Sheikh, and the building that housed his tomb. And here is a photograph. It's more recent, very recent, but some decades ago. Obviously, this is maybe 100 years after the episode of Shaykh Tabarsi, and we can see the shrine of Shaykh Tabarsi, and there is a well here that the Bábís used to get water. So, and here, this is the current structure over the tomb of Shaykh Tabarsi in Iran, and people go to visit the tomb of this sheikh. And here is a photograph of the inside of this structure, and you can see in the back, you can see the tomb of the sheikh, and there are some people standing there visiting the tomb. So I have already explained a little bit why the Bábís decided to stay at Shaykh Tabarsi, because in Mazandaran, they were trapped. They could not leave Mazandaran, and they were an easy target for their enemies. And if they tried to leave Mazandaran and travel the narrow byways of Mazandaran, then it was very easy for their enemies to identify them and kill them, because the Bábís were not from Mazandaran. The people of Mazandaran, they have their own dialect, and also the Bábís, their dress also would reveal that they were strangers in the area. And we know that for a time after the Bábís arrived at the shrine of Shaykh Tabarsi, that the people of Mazandaran, villagers and townspeople, attacked all the strangers that were in the area and robbed them and killed. Even some of them were killed by the local people, native people of Mazandaran, these strangers that were in the area. So when they entered the shrine, Mulla Husayn gathered his companions and told them that this was the place that all of them would be killed. And when the Bábís realized that there was no way they could leave Mazandaran and that all of them were going to die there, they decided to prepare for a defensive war, and they hoped that by fighting bravely and meeting a heroic death, they could testify to the truth of their cause. And this is really the essence of the episode of Shaykh Tabarsi, and the same applies to the Mazandaran, to the Zanjan and Neyri's upheavals as well. That these events, when the Bábís discovered that they had, they were going to be killed, they chose to make it a proclamation of the cause of the Báb. This was, really the meaning of Shaykh Tabarsi event for the Bábís there. But there were no troops were sent against the Bábís until December. And the reason was that the chiefs of Mazandaran, they had been obliged to go to Tehran for the coronation of Nasruddin Shah. And so this was the only reason that they were not able to gather an army and attack the Bábís any earlier. But in the meantime, the inhabitants of Qadi Kala, the village of Khosrow Qadi Kalai, whom the Bábís had killed, they attacked the Bábís at the shrine. And in this period from September to December, when the Bábís arrived at Shaykh Ṭabarsí, and December, the time of the first major attack that troops arrived at Shaykh Ṭabarsí. During this period, other Bábís were able to join the party of the Bábís at Shaykh Ṭabarsí, and it was also during this period that Baha'u'llah visited Shaykh Ṭabarsí and also advised that Quddus should join them. And so Quddus, after Baha'u'llah's visit, the Bábís were able to release Quddus from his confinement, and then he joined the Bábís at Shaykh Ṭabarsí. And their number gradually rose to about 500, so that by January 1849, there were 500 Bábís at Shaykh Ṭabarsí. And so the chiefs of Mazandaran, when they were in Tehran for the coronation of Nasruddin Shah, he ordered them to attack the Bábís and basically, wipe them out. And so these chiefs, they arrived at Shaykh Ṭabarsí in December, and they had a militia of about 4,000 people. And in late December, the Bábís made an attack on the troops of the governor and of these chiefs, Mazandarani chiefs, and then they surprised them and routed them. And it is reported in the eyewitness accounts that they killed about 70 of the troops, including the commander of the army. And one eyewitness says that the entire battle lasted only about an hour. And the Bábís were also able to capture a huge amount of ammunition and provisions and about 100 horses. And this was very significant for them because at the time of their arrival at Shaykh Ṭabarsí, they had only 7 muskets, and they may also have had 5 horses. So this was significant that they were able to capture a huge amount of ammunition. And after this defeat, Nasruddin Shah gave emphatic orders to his uncle, whom he had appointed as the new governor of Mazandaran, to eradicate the Bábís. And we have this edict of Nasruddin Shah, we have the text of it. And it is dated 3rd of Safar, 1265, which corresponds to the 29th of December, 1848. And in this edict, the Bábí movement is referred to as a fresh heresy, the extermination of which is required by the religion. And Nasruddin Shah also wrote, there is a marginal note on this edict where Nasruddin Shah himself has written some instructions to Mehdi Quli Mirza, his uncle, the governor of Mazandaran. He says that it is true, Mehdi Quli Mirza, you must exert yourself to the utmost in this affair. This is not a trifling amusement. The fate of our religion and of Shi'i doctrine hangs in the balance. You must cleanse the realm of this filthy and reprobate sect so that not a trace of them remains. And here is the image of this edict, and as the note of Nasruddin Shah, this is Nasruddin Shah's handwriting here, and what I read is part of this text, the English translation of that text. So then the Prince Governor arrived near Shaykh Ṭabarsí in January, and he was waiting for the troops, additional troops of Abbas Qoli Khan Larijani, so he did not attack the Bábís immediately. And the Bábís, when they discovered that he was waiting for reinforcements, they decided to attack first. And so in late January, about 200 Bábís, they sortied from their fortifications and routed the government forces. But during this attack, Quddus was injured. And I think that it was after Quddus, when he was injured, that Mulla Husayn decided. He was very upset about what had happened, and he decided that he was ready to sacrifice his life for Quddus. This is my own personal understanding of it. So after this clash, then Abbas Qoli Khan arrived with his troops, and their number gradually rose to about 6,000. And in early February, the Bábís again, they attacked the troops of Abbas Qoli Khan. By this time, the Prince Governor, he had escaped the area and he had gone to gather new forces. So Abbas Qoli Khan and his troops, they were there, they were waiting for the prince to arrive. So the Bábís attacked him and his forces before the prince was back with his reinforcements. And this time it is reported that about 400 of the troops were killed in this attack, and partly it was because in the confusion at night they had started to shoot at each other. But the Bábís also, they suffered many casualties, and more than 40 of them were killed during the confrontation, during the attack, or after the battle of their injuries, including Mulla Husayn. So Mulla Husayn was killed during this battle. And so when the prince returned, gradually the number of the troops reached somewhere between 10 and 12,000. And in March also, a detachment of soldiers arrived from Tehran with artillery. And they started in the second half of March, they started a heavy bombardment of the fort. And according to one eyewitness, every day somewhere between 150 and 200 shells were fired at the fort. So many Bábís lost their lives during this heavy bombardment in the last 2 months of the siege. And by early April, the Bábís had used up all their supplies of rice and grain, and already also consumed their horses, and from then on, they had to live on grass. And then also the troops, at one point, they discovered that the Bábís left the fort at night to collect grass. So they, even during the night, they continued firing at the area around the fort of Shaykh Ṭabarsí. So the Bábís could no longer get a hold of grass. So for the last 19 days of the siege, the Bábís were reduced to eating the putrefied meat and skin and bones of their dead horses, and even the leather of their saddles. So this was the situation. And still, they continued to resist. And it was only by treachery that the siege ended. The Prince Governor, he promised that if the Bábís left the fort, they would be safe. And he also signed the Quran. Copies of Quran were sealed and sent to the fort. So the Bábís agreed, as a sign of their reverence for the Quran, they agreed to leave the fort. And they left the fort on 9th of May. And there were about 220 Bábís alive of the 500 that had been, initially about in January had been there. About 220 had survived. But then the day after they left the fort, they were disarmed and they were massacred. But the Prince Governor did not execute Quddus. He wanted to take him to the capital as a trophy. I mean, that was his intention. But when he arrived in Barfurush, he was forced to hand him over to Sayyidul Ulama, and the first thing he did was that with his own hands, he tore off Quddus's ears, and then he handed him over to a mob who killed him brutally. And so his martyrdom happened on the 17th of May in 1849, and with his martyrdom, we can say that the episode at Shaykh Tabarsi came to an end. And if I should maybe spend one more minute and relate an anecdote just once in the 1990s, I was in Denmark. I gave a presentation about the faith, and I said nothing about the history of the faith. The presentation was not about the history of the faith. But there were also some Muslim Iranians present, and they, after I was finished with my presentation, one of them asked, who is Mullah Husayn? Can you tell me about Mullah Husayn? I was a bit surprised because I had not said anything about the history of the faith, let alone, talk about, the Bábís and Mullah Husayn. But I said, different things about him. But after they, everyone had started to leave and the event was finished, I went to this person and asked him, how come you asked me about Mullah Husayn? And he said that I am from Bushruye, Mullah Husayn's hometown. And he said that, whenever people in my hometown want to curse you, that is the Baha'is today, whenever they want to curse you, they curse Mullah Husayn. That's why I was curious to know who Mullah Husayn is. And in a sense, this Mullah Husayn sacrificed everything, not only his life, but even his good name for, many Iranians today. But one day, we are sure that the station of these early heroes of the faith will be appreciated. People will realize their station, and they would have a different opinion about them. And I would like to conclude with reading what the Guardian writes about the Shaykh Ṭabarsí episode. This is from God Passes By, and I think what he says sums up really the essence of the episode of Shaykh Ṭabarsí. He says that it was caused by the unconcealed determination of the dawnbreakers of a new age to proclaim fearlessly and befittingly its advent, and by no less unyielding resolve, should persuasion prove a failure, to resist and defend themselves against the onslaughts of malicious and unreasoning assailants. It demonstrated beyond the shadow of a doubt what the indomitable spirit of a band of 313 untrained, unequipped, yet God-intoxicated students, mostly sedentary recluses of the college and cloister, could achieve when pitted in self-defense against a trained army, well-equipped, supported by the masses of the people, blessed by the clergy, headed by prince of the royal blood, backed by the resources of the state, acting with the enthusiastic approval of its sovereign, and animated by the unfailing counsels of a resolute and all-powerful minister. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Siamak. That's really amazing. The information is so detailed. It answers many, many questions that had been in my mind for years. Just why they didn't keep going and why they stayed and how they ended up there, and even why they were going to Tahrik in the first place, because that was never, I think, made very clear in Dawnbreakers. So I'm really grateful for this presentation, and it answered many of my questions for sure. Let me look here. Jill Johnson asks a sort of interesting question. How do they feed the horses?
Well, they had, I mentioned that it was in December, the first attack, major attack on the Bábís, that, troops arrived and attacked them. It was in December. From September to December, the Bábís were able to make contact with the local people, and so they had funds. Among them, as you remember, was Haji Abdul-Majid Nishaburi, the father of Bábí, and he was a merchant, a wealthy merchant. So they were able to pay for, provisions, purchase provisions. And so that was, and part of the reason that at one point, they let some of the horses, out of the fort, and then slaughtered the rest, was because, once the fort had been besieged, then they didn't want to use the grain to feed the horses, so they had to slaughter the horses and, let about 30 of them out of the fort. So so they had a stored provision in the period before the major attack started. They had the opportunity to purchase provisions from the local people.
I gather, I had always been under the impression that the army sort of surrounded the fort, or the fort was surrounded from the beginning, and remained surrounded for 7 months or so. But I gather from what you're saying that it was really only surrounded for more like 2 months or 3 months.
That's
and,
right.
And in many cases, when the Bábís were sortieing out of the fort, they weren't just going out and attacking the army surrounding them, but 10 kilometers away in one case.
Yes, yes. The attack, when the Prince Governor arrived, he was in the village of Waskas. Waskas is about 10 kilometers away from Shaykh Ṭabarsí. And there is also a river that, separates Shaykh Ṭabarsí from Waskas. So the Bábís, but this was in the winter, so the Bábís had to cross the river. And by that time, some of the local people, Mazandaranis, had converted to the Bábí faith and joined the Bábís at Shaykh Tabarsi. And since the Prince Governor, he was waiting for reinforcements of this Abbas Qoli Khan Larijani Mazandarani troops to arrive. These Mazandarani Bábís, they pretended to be the soldiers of Abbas Qoli Khan who were coming to join the prince. So in this way, the Bábís were able to get very close to the camp of the Prince Governor, and then once they discovered that they are Bábís, they started their attack and routed the governor's forces. Yes. So that was 10 kilometers away. Yes, Waskas is 10 kilometers away.
And that also explains how the Bábís knew what was going on, also how they got the intelligence, because by then they had local allies, not only as people joining the defense at Shaykh Ṭabarsí, but probably their cousins and others who knew what was going on and were telling them. And also that also meant they were no longer wandering blindly around in the forest too, because they had local people who could guide them.
That's right. That's right.
That's a really important development, I see, because that's the reason they couldn't really leave is because it's not like they go out and get on Route 1 and there's a sign saying, Tabriz 500 kilometers that way or something like that. It was a maze of small winding roads in the woods going from village to village, and then no signs and no maps. But once you've got some local people helping you out to guide you around, you can go 10 kilometers out. Now that was the first attack where they, I think you said 70 were killed, and where they got the ammunition and everything. Was that 10 kilometers away, or was that closer?
That was much closer. The troops of the Mazandarani chiefs, they had camped at the village of Afra, which is, even perhaps not even a kilometer away. So this was very close. And partly, I think it was partly because, as we just read what the Guardian said about the Bábís, that, they were not trained, for battle at all. They had no training for battle. So initially, I think, the troops, the Mazandarani chiefs, underestimated the Bábís. So that's why, they came and set their camp and were not afraid of the Bábís. And as I mentioned also, the first sortie, it happened in broad daylight. So they attacked the troops of the chief Sarkardes of Mazandaran, in broad daylight, and, within an hour, they routed them.
And presumably, because they weren't worrying about the Bábís, they didn't have any scouts out watching either. So there was no real warning or anything for the attack. And if it's only a kilometer away, sitting at Shaykh Ṭabarsí, you could hear 4,000 or 5,000 soldiers and see their smoke, so you knew they were there.
Yes.
So certainly you wouldn't even need to know how to go through the forest to get there, because you'd know from the sound of the smoke that they were there from all the campfires and things.
Yes.
That's interesting. So then the second major sortie is 10 kilometers away.
Yes.
And then after that, it's much closer, because then the army really moves in.
Yes. Yes. And by March, then when artillery arrives and the number of troops has reached, 10 to 12,000, then the siege is complete and no provisions. The Bábís are no longer able to receive, provisions, and no one is able to join the Bábís. So that was, so by that time, that was the end of it.
They're sealed off. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the first thing you do in siege warfare. You surround the other side so they can't get anything in and out. That's thousands of years old, that tactic. Phil asks, do we have any additional information about the background of those God-intoxicated students, the ones who were not as well known as Quddus and Mulla Husayn? I've always wondered what they were studying, where, and why they joined Mulla Husayn's party. And thank you for a wonderful presentation, he says.
Thank you very much. I mean, we have one of the, and Persian Baha'i has written a book about the Shaykh Tabarsi episode, and he has gathered any piece of information that he was able about the identity of the participants and also, their background. One thing that I need to say is, to understand just the context better. The middle of the 19th century, probably not even 1% of the population were literate. This we need to, keep in mind. So these, the people often, when they converted to the religion of the Bab, it was not necessarily, for many of them, it was not by, reading the writings of the Bab. It was mostly because of their belief in the prophecies, Islamic prophecies about the coming of the Qa'im, and then their encounter with, Bábí teachers, who were spreading the message. They would proclaim the message of the Bab and share the news of the coming of the Qa'im. It was mostly, the conversion happened because of this personal, contact with the Bábí teachers. And we know that, when the Bábís, they were traveling from Khorasan to Mazandaran, when they left Mashhad, then in villages they would stop and they would meet with people and tell them about the coming of the Qa'im. And some of these people, they would convert, they would accept their, message of the Bábís and would join them. And then, and the same way that later also at Shaykh Ṭabarsí, some of the local people, they would, establish some contact. And then after some time, they would see that, then they would accept that, okay, they represent the cause of the Qa'im and join them. So it's not like, and when we say that, these were, many of them were religious students, it is not necessarily, a formal kind of a school. It could be also, just that they had a teacher who taught them about, studied, about Islam, about, the Islam, the Quran, Islamic prophecies, religious literature, and, in private. They might have received, private tutoring or some, local school with, a few students. So this was the case. It's not like, the majority of the Bábís at this time, they were as, highly educated, like Quddus and Mulla Husayn. And even Quddus, to some extent, he was self-taught in a sense, we could say, to some extent.
It seems to me that Peter Smith or somebody also had collected or analyzed information about the social class backgrounds of the defenders at Shaykh Ṭabarsí. Do you recall any of that data?
Yes, that is, of course, this is all based on, Persian sources that we have, and so he has done that, and also Abbas Amanat, also in one of the chapters in his book about the Bábí history, that, he has also a section about the social status and the background of the Bábí participants. And we have information about only half of them. So even, that, even that information that we have, and sometimes it's just by the name, because, often names at this time, they also, there was, it consisted of a part, for instance, that said something about the profession of the, the person. So it is in this way that, we have been able to, gather some information about the social background of the Bábís. And of course, we know that the majority of them, or they were, religious students, and, after, or if not, the largest, you could say, segment of the participants were, people with a background, in Islamic religious studies. To the extent that, anything like that existed in Iran. And then there were, there were merchants, there were people from, skilled workers, and, so that was, so we have some information, yes, about the background of the Bábís.
And I suspect a lot of the people for whom we don't have any background would have been some of those villagers who joined on the way, and therefore we don't have, you know, recollections about them from other people who were Bábís later or anything.
Yes.
Jeanette, this seems to be Jeff. Please elaborate on the defensive posturing of the Bábís as directed by Quddus. It is my understanding that they never attacked unless first attacked by the army.
Well, I think, you know, this, we need to, try to define, you know, what defense means. In this context, with the Bábís being, you know, really taking shelter in a shrine and then building a fort around it, the whole nature of this, you know, the battle was, you know, defensive warfare on the part of the Bábís. So the fact that the Bábís carried out sorties, you know, it doesn't make their, you know, attacks and this battle, you know, their manner of warfare any less defensive. It's just the nature of it. Because if we, you know, if we say defense means that, you know, somebody should, you know, you should give the opportunity for your enemy to strike you first, and then if the first strike, you know, by a sword doesn't kill you, then you return the strike, you know, this doesn't make any sense. So in this context, defensive warfare, also carrying out sorties, this is part of defensive warfare in this context. So otherwise, you know, if we say defense, you know, it has to be defensive in the sense that, you know, you let them shoot you first, and then if you survive, you return the attack. You know, this is not defense. You know, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't exaggerate, you know, what defense means or have a complete, misconception about, you know, what defense means. In this context, the whole warfare was defensive.
Right. It started in Bar Farouche when they were first attacked. In that sense, it was defensive from then on. Jody asks, do we know what happened to the remains of Mulla Husayn?
He was buried near the tomb of the Shaykh Ṭabarsí, but we don't know now. And of course, you know, Mulla Husayn and all the other Bábís, they were never, you know, their bodies were not moved to another place. They stayed there. But what has happened, I haven't heard anything. Fortunately, because the place also has some religious significance to the, you know, to the people in Iran, to the Muslim population. So I don't think, you know, they have tried to desecrate. And obviously the graves were not identified or marked in any way. So presumably they are still, you know, the bodies, the remains of them are still there in the area surrounding the tomb of Shaykh Tabarsi.
Paul asks, have you had an opportunity to see all of Effie Baker's photos, including those that weren't included in the Dawnbreakers?
I have not. No, I have not.
And Al asks, how do you know how Mulla Husayn's sword was recovered? The Shah being only a teenager, was his letter to his uncle written by him or by the all-powerful minister? Oh, that's a separate question by Shahla. I couldn't tell the difference. So the sword.
Yes, about the sword, I mean, this, to my best knowledge, I mean, Mulla Husayn, there is the sword that is on display in the international archives. I mean, it is not necessarily the same sword. I mean, he might have had more than one sword. But unfortunately, I don't know the story about the sword, how it was recovered. I don't know it. Actually, I should look into this because I know some people who know the story. I mean, but this was done, this happened in the time of Shoghi Effendi. In the same way, you know, I don't really know how the edict of Nasiruddin Shah came into the hands of Baha'is. You know, it's very significant that we have this document, but, you know, unfortunately, I don't know the story. I don't know how it came into the hands of the Baha'is. About the second question, about Nasiruddin Shah being a teenager, he was 17 years old at the time. His own handwriting, I mean, it is his own handwriting. He was, I mean, being a prince, you know, he was in a position to receive the best education that was available in Iran at the time. So he was, he was able, I mean, the note is in his own handwriting. But of course, you know, like, you know, even I think even if he was older, the edict that was written, the text was not necessarily dictated by him. But what he says in the part that, he has written by his own hand, it is very obvious, his religious bigotry is quite obvious. We don't need to read the text of the edict, the proper part of the, the edict itself. And his marginal note, Nasruddin Shah's marginal note, reveals quite a lot about his attitude about toward the Bábís.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the edict itself would have been cleaned up by a secretary, written very nicely by a secretary and that sort of thing, not by the king himself. And Al also asks whether you can ask a question about Badasht. So I suppose we can get to that if he wants to ask that in a little while. Then we have, how many Bábís had been killed in Iran by the time of the Ṭabarsí event?
Not many. So this is, if you remember about the Tahirih in Qazvin, that, this is October 1847, that this was the first time that some Bábís were killed in Iran, and this was after the uncle of Tahirih was killed by a Shaykhi, who was, because the uncle was, used abusive language against the founder of the Shaykhi movement, and so there was one, Shaykhi that killed the uncle of Tahirih. And after that incident, of course, the Bábís were blamed for it, because the uncle was also very hostile towards the Bábís, and Tahirih was blamed for it. Tahirih was, considered to be, responsible in the plot to kill her uncle. And so that was the first time that several Bábís in Iran were killed. But it was not, until the Shaykh Ṭabarsí episode, the incidents that we have, these are, the government, the state is not involved, with the exception of the case of, after the assassination of the uncle of Tahirih, that the government gave in to the pressure from, the clerics and, handed some of the Bábís over to them who were, who were killed by them. The government had not acted to kill any Bábís. So the Shaykh Ṭabarsí episode is the first time that government troops are sent against the Bábís, and hundreds of Bábís were killed.
Let's see. Then we have Reza asks, this is a very interesting question. I was tempted to ask it myself, actually. In regard to the number of Bábís, I heard a few times that you said 500, but according to Islamic prophecy, the number 319 has been mentioned. The Dawnbreaker says that there were 319 defenders, and Quddus ordered the gate closed at that point. Could you please clarify?
Yes. So this, actually, the number that is mentioned in the Islamic prophecies is 313. And here in the quotation from God Passes By, the Guardian, Shoghi Effendi, he refers to a band of 313 untrained, unequipped, yet God-intoxicated students. So the number is 313, the number that is mentioned in the Islamic traditions, but the number has its significance is that it corresponds to the numerical value of the word jaish, which means army. So in Islamic traditions, the jaish, or the army of the Qa'im, is mentioned. And because the numerical value of jaish is 313, it is reported that the Qa'im's companions, there are 313 of them. So, and I think that, for this reason, among some Bábís, it was circulated that the number of the companions at Shaykh Ṭabarsí was exactly 313. But I think this, as we know, the fulfillment of prophecies, it doesn't have to be literal. So that even when there are traditions that refer to the number 313, and I just explained why this particular figure, because it is the numerical value of the word jaish, which means army. The fulfillment of those prophecies, it didn't have to happen, exactly according to the letter of the prophecy. So definitely, I mean, the sources that we have, they indicate, and there are eyewitness accounts. I mean, we have eyewitness accounts. Haji Nasir Ghazvini, who was present there, he says that there were about 500 Bábís. And another eyewitness account, he says that at one point, the companions, they numbered, how many were there, and the figure that they reached was 444. So we have that report, and of course, later we know that for a period, other Bábís were able to join. So I think, to my best knowledge, 500 is the correct estimate.
And the fort altogether, including the wall around it, couldn't have been more than 40 or 50 meters by 40 or 50 meters. It was pretty small. That's not a big space for 500 people to be in.
I mean, the shrine itself was smaller than the fort. When they built the fort, they cleared the area around the shrine, and so they cut the trees and used the trees to make walls and make a fort. So the fort itself was bigger than the shrine. So the sketch that that we saw that shows the size of the shrine, the fort itself was bigger than that.
Oh. That's good. Boyd asks, are there any more details about Baha'u'llah's visit to the fort?
Not really. We know that the Baha'u'llah also made the second attempt to join the Bábís at Shaykh Ṭabarsí. You remember it from the Dawnbreakers, and that the second time he was the party. It was discovered that they were Bábís and they were trying to join the other Bábís at Shaykh Tabarsi. So then he was in the party. I mean, everyone was arrested and he was taken to Amol and was bastinado. You remember that. So right. The first time would have been before December 1848, but we don't have anything other than, or at least I have not seen anything about Baha'u'llah's visit other than what Nabil writes about it. It is not mentioned. The other eyewitness accounts that I have seen, the earliest eyewitness account that we have, which was written within 3 years and 3 months of the conclusion of the episode, does not refer to Baha'u'llah's visit. So we don't know much about that. It is possible that, in Nabil's narrative, in the original version of Nabil's narrative, there is more information available about Baha'u'llah's visit, but I have not seen the original version, so I don't know.
Sure. Al also asks this question: was there a woman who disguised herself as a man and joined the defenders at Shaykh Ṭabarsí?
Not that I have seen anything about this in any sources that I have looked at. Primary sources, I mean the eyewitness accounts and other primary sources that I have looked at, there is nothing, I have not seen anything about that. We know that Tahiri also attempted to join the Bábís at Shaykh Tabarsi, but did not succeed. We know about that. So to my best knowledge, at Shaykh Tabarsi, there were not a single female at Shaykh Tabarsi.
Al might also be thinking of the woman in Zanjan who yes. Was fighting. That was who, Zainab?
Yes, Zainab, who received the the title Rostam Ali. So there were, of course, the Bábí women. I mean, she participated as a combatant, but other Bábí women, of course, and children supported, basically the men that were fighting in Zanjan. So. And many of them were also killed during the battle in Zanjan. But at right. Shaykh Tabarsi, no women, not a single woman participated.
Right. Well, Zanjan was a besieged neighborhood, so there were families caught up in that particular attack against the Bábís. Let's see. Then Al, here's his question about Tahiri. His question about Badasht. How is it that that Tahiri unveiled herself? The research department has said it isn't sure, but from the historical information that exists, the women at that time only removed their ruband if they wanted to unveil themselves. So what is the ruband? That just part covering the face, or?
Ruband is, yes, what covers the face. I mean, this is what we have. I mean, this it says in the Nabil's narrative that she appeared, and we have it in God Passes By, that she appeared unveiled. It's not like, she went to the meeting and then in front of the men, took off her veil, but she appeared there unveiled and also adorned. This is also important that, this, because in the Quran, there is a verse that says that women should not show their adornments. So this it's not just that her face shows, but also that, she's wearing adornments and she's revealing them, indicating that, this Islamic dispensation is, basically has ended. So this was the significance of it. It's not just that she's showing her face, but also that she's adorned. And so this is also important. This is another bit of it that is important. But I have no other information about that. In what manner this was done, I don't know anything else about that.
Paul asks this very interesting question, and that's the account of the raising of the black standard. And does that also connect to the 313? And I would add to that, as I understand it, that black standard has now been reappropriated by ISIS. And I think it's the same prophecy. So I thought I'd ask you about that.
Okay. There is much I can say about the black standard. So the narrative that we have, Nabil's narrative says that Mulla Husayn, when outside Mashhad, when the party began their journey towards Mazandaran, he unfurled the black standard. He raised the black standard, and this standard, basically until the fort of Shaykh Ṭabarsí fell, this standard was, waving at the fort. And during the trip, they carried this black standard. My own understanding, based on the eyewitness accounts that I have seen, there is no reference to a black standard in those accounts. And it is understood, the Bábís, the first major eyewitness account that we have, he says that Mulla Husayn was wearing a black garment because after the Báb had been bastinadoed in April 1848, as a sign of mourning, Mulla Husayn was wearing black. And so this eyewitness account, one of the Bábís who was there, he says that this is the fulfillment of the prophecy about the black standard being raised in Khorasan and being carried, from Khorasan. So I have not seen anything in the eyewitness accounts that point to the Bábís having raised a black standard. Nothing about that. Rather, their understanding was that just the act of Mulla Husayn, his action of, with the party moving from Mashhad, from Khorasan toward Mazandaran, that was the fulfillment of the prophecy. And there is another Bábí account, it's not an eyewitness account, that says that Mulla Husayn himself was the black standard. So, and we have also one eyewitness account that suggests, the way he describes it, suggests that, the Bábís there who were in Mulla Husayn's company, they understood that Mulla Husayn was the black standard and that, their action was the fulfillment of that prophecy about black standards. But historically, we know that, during the time toward the end of the Bani Umayyad dynasty, the first Islamic dynasty, when there were rebellions against the Umayyads, there was also a rebellion that was organized in Khorasan, and the army there, they raised the black standard and then moved, and they were successful in toppling the Umayyad dynasty. So this is, for this reason, the issue of raising the black standard in Khorasan has significance. But as I said, in the eyewitness accounts and other early Bábí sources that I have looked at, there is nothing about the Bábís raising the black standard on their trip. And there is more I can say. There is, in an article that I published in 2002, I also explained about the tradition of Chabush Khani. This is that, people who wanted to go on pilgrimage, and so the guide would raise a black standard, a black banner, and then it would show that, there is a group of pilgrims that are on their way to Karbala in Iraq, And so others, when they would see the black standard, if they wanted to go on pilgrimage, they would join. So there is also this practice that existed in Iran, in 19th century Iran. But and the Bábís also, at least when they arrived in Mazandaran, they pretended to be pilgrims, on the way to Karbala. So it is likely that, for that reason, they might have had a black standard. But I have not seen anything that confirms this, that, other than what Nabil says, which I am not positive that, what he says is accurate. But so my own understanding is that Mullah Husayn was the black standard.
Very interesting. And the ISIS people talk about black standards too, I believe. Have you heard anything about that? Is it the same prophecy or the same historical background?
Probably, it must be, yes. I would think so, yes.
Yeah, that was my question. Okay. And there are no more questions here, but I have one more question. Do we know how many sorties were made out of the fort then? Sounds like there were 3.
The ones, the ones that I mentioned, yes. So that was all that happened. And the first one in broad daylight on, the Mazandarani chiefs, then on the prince governor, that happened. That was in late January, and then the one on the troops of Abbas Qoli Khan, where Mullah Husayn was martyred. So these are the 3 that I know that I also described. So I don't think there were any more.
And it may not have been practical once the army had surrounded the fort and had erected their own earthworks and these kinds of things to protect themselves against a sortie. I mean, if you have to run across 100 meters of bare ground to attack the army, even at night, it would be very difficult for 200 men who might be weakened from starvation to do that against an army of 10 to 12,000.
Yes.
So,
and the sortie, it has, it can be effective only if it is a surprise attack. If the army, the troops were expecting the Bábís to attack at night and were ready for them, it would not have any point in, carrying out a sortie. So. Yeah,
that's true. I don't see any more questions. Jill says, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And this really was a fascinating talk. Siomak, I'm just checking, see if there's anything else, and there's nothing else. This was really fascinating, and I really thank you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today for this fascinating web talk, and I look forward to seeing you in the future at future web talks.